Plato is often introduced as one of history's greatest philosophers, but he is also one of the earliest and most influential critiques of literature. In his work titled The Republic, Plato raises a question that remains central to literary criticism even today. He asked, what kind of a power does literature or stories in general have over the audience? For the ancient Greeks, this was far more than a minor question, because poetry for them was not simply a leisure activity. Rather, it was something that shaped their ideas about gods, humans, heroism, grief, justice, beauty, truth, etc. It showed them the proper way to live. Therefore, poetry was not merely private entertainment or a subject that was taught in schools. Epics, drama, and poetry together helped Greeks learn their history, understand their society, imagine their gods, and form ideas about how a person should live. Thus, we can say that poets were, in many ways, public educators. This was a powerful position to hold because, in this way, poets could shape the minds of the individuals. And Plato, as we will see later in this video, is highly suspicious of this exact power. Now, to understand Plato's intellectual development, we need to know about Socrates. We all know that Plato was a student and a close follower of Socrates. When Socrates was condemned to death in 399 BCE, it became a decisive event for Plato's philosophical and literary thoughts. Socrates was formally charged with impiety, which basically refers to failing to respect the gods of Athens and introducing kinda unfamiliar divine ideas. And the second charge on Socrates was of corrupting the young minds through his habit of questioning the established beliefs and authority. These charges emerged from a tense political and cultural atmosphere. Athens had recently suffered defeat in the Peloponnesian War and had briefly been ruled by the 30 tyrants, which was an oligarchic regime. Some men associated with Socrates later became connected with political violence or opposition to democracy. This, as well as his habit of publicly questioning the politicians, poets, and teachers, made Socrates appear dangerous to a society that was kinda already suspicious of the intellectual and the political dissent. Aristophanes' comedy titled The Clouds had also helped in creating a public image of Socrates as a kind of a ridiculous and impious intellectual who taught young men to manipulate arguments. The trial of Socrates forced Plato to confront a disturbing possibility, which was that a democratic society could condemn a truthful person who was committed to examining truth, and the persuasive public opinions could overpower careful reasoning. And this is what exactly happened with Socrates, right? He did not lead a rebellion or openly ask people to overthrow the Athenian government. What he did was just ask uncomfortable questions. He questioned the politicians who claimed to understand justice. He questioned the poets who claimed to teach wisdom. And he also questioned the ordinary citizens who believed that they knew what was right simply because the tradition had told them so. His only mistake was that Athens at that point was a city that was already frightened by war, political violence, and social instability. And in such an environment, these kind of questions could seem dangerous. Socrates made powerful people look uncertain. He encouraged young minds to think for themselves and refused to accept popular opinions as truth. Over time, people had begun to see him not as a teacher who was helping Athens examine itself, but as someone who was weakening its values and influencing its youth in harmful ways. So, from Plato's perspective, Socrates was condemned not because he was truly corrupt or impious, but because Athens could not tolerate the kind of questioning that he represented. This is why Socrates' death affected Plato so deeply, because it showed him that a society can punish a person for seeking truth when the truth challenges what people are comfortable believing. Therefore, we see that later in his life, when Plato writes the Republic, he argues that a just society must be guided by genuine knowledge rather than popularity, persuasion, or unstable public opinion. He also argued that philosophers must be the kings, because philosophers are enlightened beings who can govern the society in a just manner. The effect of Socrates can also be witnessed in his texts. Rather than writing philosophical doctrines as straightforward textbooks, Plato composed dialogues, which were dramatic conversations in which characters questioned one another, they made different claims, they discovered contradictions, and they were ready to revise their positions. Through this form, Plato preserves Socrates' method of question and answer and also presents Socrates as a model of intellectual and moral inquiry. Now, this also creates a paradox. Plato, as we have already seen, he was deeply suspicious of poetry and other forms of artistic imitation because they can move the audiences emotionally. Yet, he himself uses narrative, character, irony, dramatic setting, and powerful images to lead readers towards philosophical reflections. His dialogues show that he did not simply reject literary form, rather, he wanted to distinguish between representations that obscure truth and those that help the mind. And now, when we are talking about Plato's views about reality and appearances, we have to know about his theory of forms and the allegory of the cave. To understand Plato's criticism of literature, we first need to understand his theory of forms. This is one of his most important ideas, but it can sound abstract at first. So let us take it slowly and use an example that Plato himself discusses, the example of a bed. Imagine that there are many different beds in the world. One may be made of wood, another of metal, and another of plastic. Some may be large, some small, some comfortable, and some poorly designed. They may look completely different, yet we recognize all of them as beds. Plato asks, how is this possible? What allows us to recognize different objects as belonging to the same category? His answer is that behind all these individual beds is a perfect and unchanging reality, the form of the bed. The form is not one particular bed that exists somewhere in a room. It is the ideal idea or the essence, you can say, of what a bed truly is. It is what makes all these particular beds recognizable. Every physical bed is only an imperfect example or an imperfect copy of that ideal form. Plato's form of the bed, the form of the bed is like that ideal, eternal, perfect, original bed that exists somewhere. It is eternal, unchanging, and it is independent of any particular object. Even if every physical bed in the world disappeared, the form of the bed, that is the ideal bed, it would still exist as the perfect idea of what a bed is supposed to be. Now imagine a carpenter making a bed. The carpenter takes wood, tools, measurements, and knowledge and produces an actual physical object. This bed is useful and it is real, but it is not perfect. It can break, it may decay, or it may be poorly designed. It is one particular attempt to express that ideal form of the bed in the physical material reality. Now imagine a painter looking at that bed and painting a picture of it. The painter does not make another usable bed. The painter is only creating an image of the bed, copying its shape, color, and appearance. Plato is using this example to explain his suspicion of art. He says that the form of the bed is the perfect and eternal reality, it is the ideal form. Then, the carpenter's bed is a physical and imperfect version of that reality. And finally, the painter's picture of the bed is only an imitation of the physical bed that was made by the carpenter. So the picture is removed from the truth. It shows what the bed looks like, but it does not give us any knowledge of how a bed is made or what makes it useful. This is what Plato means by mimesis or imitation. Art imitates the appearance of things. A painter can make a bed look convincing without knowing how to construct one. In the same way, a poet can write beautifully about war without being a military commander, or about medicine without being a doctor, or about justice without understanding what justice truly is. For Plato, this creates a serious problem. An artist may produce the appearance of knowledge without actually possessing knowledge. The audience may feel that it truly understands something simply because the artistic representation of it is vivid and emotionally powerful. This leads to Plato's distinction between the two levels of reality. The first is the world of appearances. This is the physical world that we experience through our senses. It contains particular objects and events, but everything here changes. It is temporary. Bodies grow old, buildings decay, opinions also shift, and the political systems rise and fall. Because this world is unstable, Plato believes that it cannot provide the highest form of knowledge. The second is the world of forms. This is the realm of eternal, unchanging truths. The forms cannot be seen with the eyes in the way that physical objects can be seen. They must be understood only through reason, philosophical questioning, and education. The most important of all forms is the form of the good. Plato compares it to the sun. The sun makes physical objects visible, while the good makes truth and knowledge possible. Just as we cannot see clearly without light, Plato believes that the mind cannot understand reality without grasping the good. Now we can understand why Plato is suspicious of poetry and painting. If the physical world already contains imperfect versions of the forms, then artistic representations may be copies of those imperfect versions only, making them thrice removed from reality. So the structure kind of looks like this. There's this form of the bed, which exists in its ideal perfection. Then comes the physical bed that was constructed by the carpenter. And then comes a painting or a poetic depiction of the bed, which is referencing the bed that was made by the carpenter. So it is already copying a copy. This is why Plato describes art as an imitation of an imitation. The physical bed is already an imperfect expression of the ideal form of bed, and the painting imitates only the visible appearances of that physical bed. Plato's concern is not simply that art is false or useless. His deeper concern is that art can make appearances seem like truth. A poem about a heroic warrior may make war appear glorious without helping us understand about its moral consequences. A tragedy may make revenge seem admirable because the audience feels emotionally involved. A story about a just ruler may create the impression that we understand justice without actually defining it. So, Plato asks us to be cautious. Before accepting what a poem, play, or a painting seems to teach, we should ask, is this work giving us knowledge or only an attractive appearance? Does it help us understand reality or does it merely imitate what things look like? Does it actually strengthen reason or does it manipulate emotion? And thus we say that the theory of forms is the foundation of Plato's literary criticism. He believes that art is powerful because it can make an image feel real, but that power also makes it dangerous. If we become attached to the representations, we may stop searching for the actual truth behind it. In very simple terms, Plato believes that the world around us is like a collection of imperfect copies, while the forms are the perfect realities behind these copies. Art then often becomes a copy of those imperfect copies. That is why he places poetry under philosophical examination. He wants to know whether literature leads the mind towards truth or keeps it comfortably trapped among appearances. Now let us move on to one of the most famous passages in the Republic, which is the Allegory of the Cave. Let us begin with the story itself. Imagine a group of prisoners who have lived their entire lives chained inside a cave and they are facing a wall. They cannot turn their heads, they cannot see the entrance. All they have ever known is the wall that is in front of them. But behind them and out of their sight, there is a fire. And between the fire and the prisoners, other people carry objects, figures, and cutout shapes. Due to this, the fire casts the shadows of these objects onto the wall that is in front of the prisoners. This is the entire universe of those prisoners, the shadows that are moving across a surface. Because these prisoners have never seen anything else, they believe that these shadows are reality. If the shadow of a horse passes across the wall, they call it a horse. They even develop a kind of expertise in predicting which shadow will appear next. They compete with one another over who can interpret the shadow show most accurately. Then one prisoner is freed. At first, the experience is painful. He is forced to turn around and look toward the fire. The objects that produce the shadows seem strange and confusing. The truth is difficult to accept because his entire understanding of the world has been based on appearances. Right? The shadows that were cast due to the fire were all that he had ever known. Now imagine that if we take this prisoner even further, if we take him out of the cave and into the daylight, then the light will overwhelm him, his eyes will hurt, and he immediately cannot see the world clearly. But slowly his vision will adjust, and when he begins to see the trees, the water, the sky, and finally the sun itself, then he will know the truth. The sun represents the form of the good, which is the highest principle of truth and knowledge. Just as the sun makes the physical things visible, the good makes reality intelligible to the mind. But the story does not end with escape. The freed prisoner then must return to the cave and tell the others what he has seen. When he goes back, his eyes are not adjusted to the darkness anymore, so he stumbles and struggles to see. Now, the other prisoners interpret this as evidence that leaving the cave has harmed him, so they mock him and reject what he says. The story carries an even darker implication if you think about it. If the prisoner insists on challenging their understanding, the others may become hostile enough to destroy him or harm him. It is difficult not to hear the echo of Socrates' trial and execution in this image of a truth seeker returning to the society that does not want its assumptions disturbed. Therefore, we can understand the allegory at several levels. The chains that the prisoners are tied with, it represents ignorance and intellectual confinement. The shadows represent appearances which are mistaken for reality. Then, the object and the fire, they represent an intermediate level of understanding. It is higher than ordinary illusion, but not complete knowledge. The journey out of the cave represents education, but not the passive transfer of information. It is the education that actually enlightens the mind. The sun represents the form of the good. It is the only source of truth and intelligibility. Finally, the return to the cave represents the philosopher's responsibility to return to the society and assist those who remain trapped in ignorance. Therefore, the cave is very closely connected with Plato's view of art. The shadows on the wall are representations. They are the images produced by objects and are projected before an audience. The prisoners mistake those images for reality, right? In that sense, the cave becomes a symbolic version of Plato's criticism of poetry and drama. In the book 10 of the Republic, Plato makes his most famous and radical move. He argues that poets should be banished from the ideal republic. His argument is that firstly, poetry is imitation. It reproduces appearances without giving us the knowledge of reality. Secondly, poets often create the appearance of expertise without possessing genuine knowledge, as we have seen. He puts up examples about Homer. He says that Homer writes about war, government, medicine, and leadership. But the question is whether Homer was actually a general, a physician, or a statesman. He was not, right? So, the poet can describe these objects persuasively without understanding their underlying principles. Another point that Plato makes is that, according to him, poetry appeals strongly to the emotional and the irrational parts of the soul, the baser instincts. Tragedy invites audiences to watch characters grieve, rage, lament, and surrender to those intense emotions. Plato fears that when we enjoy these displays, we practice giving emotional impulses greater authority than reason. By watching a tragic character give way to grief, we may learn to indulge our own grief. By admiring revenge, we may begin to treat revenge as heroic. By enjoying emotional access, we may weaken our ability to govern ourselves rationally. To put it very simply, Plato sees poets as skilled producers of illusion. They are not necessarily malicious liars, but they are creators of convincing appearances who can stir emotions without possessing the knowledge their works seem to contain. This argument establishes what later scholars call the quarrel between philosophy and poetry. Philosophy claims to pursue truth through reason and examination. Poetry, on the other hand, as Plato understands it, pursues persuasive effect through imitation and emotional pleasure. In a later lecture, we will see how Aristotle, who was Plato's student, responds to this position in his Poetics and how he disregards Plato's banishment of arts and literature. For now, let's come back to Plato, and there's one last objection that Plato has against the poets. He explains how children grow up hearing stories about gods, and in Homeric epics, the gods are not always the models of wisdom or moral discipline. They are depicted as entities who lie, who quarrel, who deceive one another, who give way to jealousy, and also who grieve excessively. For Plato, this is not a harmless detail. If children are taught that divine beings behave in this way, they may begin to regard such conduct as natural, acceptable, or even admirable. If the gods themselves can deceive, lose control, or act unjustly, why should the humans be expected to behave differently? Plato is therefore treating poetry as a form of moral education. Stories do not merely describe actions, they teach audiences how to respond to those actions. They influence whom we admire, whom we pity, whom we fear, and what we consider as courageous, and what kind of a behavior we learn to excuse or accept. This is why Plato wants the stories told to the young to be carefully controlled. He believes that repeated exposure to certain images can shape character before a person has developed the reasoning that is needed to question them. A child who constantly hears that heroes win through violence or that powerful beings succeeded through deception, they may gradually begin to associate violence with greatness and deception with intelligence. We can see a similar concern in modern debates as well about the violent films, video games, social media, and online content. The question is not simply whether people can distinguish fiction from reality. Plato's deeper question is what emotional and moral habits do we practice while consuming these stories? For Plato, literature is never merely entertainment, it is something that helps the soul. That is precisely why he values it as a force of education and why he fears it when it teaches the wrong lessons. However, it is also crucial to note that Plato does not reject every form of poetry or literary expression in the Republic. He permits literature that contributes to the moral and intellectual education of the citizens, especially works that portray gods as good, truthful, just, and incapable of causing evil. Stories should present admirable characters who display courage, self control, loyalty, and devotion to the common good, and avoid excessive lamentation, comic vulgarity, cowardice, deceit, and uncontrollable desire. Plato is particularly cautious about dramatic imitation, in which poets and actors speak in the voices of morally corrupt characters. He prefers forms of narration in which poet's own voice remains clear and the content supports truth and virtue. In the book 10, we see that he allows poetry only if it can demonstrate that it is beneficial to the rational and the moral life of the city. Thus, we understand that for Plato, literature is not valued for its artistic freedom or emotional intensity. It is rather governed by ethical purpose. It must educate the soul, strengthen reason, and encourage the citizens to become just. To sum up, Plato's literary criticism rests upon a deep concern about the power of art. He believes that poetry can shape the emotions, beliefs, and moral character of its audience. Therefore, it cannot be treated as harmless entertainment. Since art imitates appearances and may create the illusion of knowledge, Plato insists that it must be guided by truth, reason, and ethical purpose. At the same time, Plato's own dialogues show that he fully understood the power of literary form. Through conversation, dramatic situation, myths, images, and character, he makes philosophy vivid and accessible. His position is therefore not a simple rejection of literature, but a demand that literature justify its influence on the soul and the city. This is why Plato remains so important to literary criticism. He compels us to ask whether literature merely imitates reality or helps us understand it, whether it educates or manipulates, and whether its emotional power strengthens reason or distracts us from truth. Even when we disagree with his decision to banish poets, we continue to engage with the question he first placed at the center of Western thinking about art.